And if you can feel your presence, it's not your presence, it's just a way of speaking. Because it's intimately you, that's why I call it your presence. You are presence. The language always creates a separation, but that's how it is. Feeling yourself as your own presence. If then any question survives in your head, you could either ask it or wait for the answer within yourself. And when you're present within, non-vital questions won't survive in the head. They're recognized as not truly alive. Abstract. In medieval times, the mind created abstractions. How many angels can dance on the head of a needle, or something like that. Or abstractions that created the religions, not the original creator, but subsequent developments. The church split into two, can't remember when, 1,500 years ago, over the dispute whether the Holy Spirit emanated from the Father or also from the Son. Getting lost in thought. And they could kill you if you didn't agree with them. So, a vital question concerns you. Perhaps your suffering, if there is any left. Pain body questions are usually helpful to everybody. I don't mean questions that are asked by the pain body. They would be very angry questions. But questions concerning what you have observed in yourself, or maybe someone very close to you. Occasionally you get questions asked by the pain body. In one group we were talking about the pain body. An active pain body, if there's a pain body in any member of the audience who is at that moment active, that doesn't feel good because the pain body doesn't like to be looked at. So occasionally it happens that somebody runs out of the room when we talk about the pain body and they're not going to the toilet. And in one group we talked about the pain body and an angry voice in the back said, "I have a question. When do we start meditating?"
Yesterday I experienced during the meditation a shifting between anxiety and somewhat fear and fearlessness. I realized that I was going deeper into a problem that I also face in my everyday life. Sometimes I get this anxiety, seems to coming out of nowhere, and sometimes I feel, absolutely nearly fearless for even very difficult situations. So I hope that you could give me some truth about that, and also how I can work with it in daily life when I experience it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fear is the universal condition. Virtually everyone, unless they're very deeply rooted within, experiences some form of fear. There are different forms of fear. Anxiety, even stress is a form of fear. Stress of, I'm not going to get there in time. Nervousness, and more extreme forms, up to panic, dread. Most pain bodies contain, I would say really every pain body contains fear as part of its makeup. But fear is not always immediately recognizable as fear. Fear can shift and be translated into something that looks very different. For example, anger. If you look behind anger, you will always find fear. I saw a little puppy at a dog training class that I attended with our with our dog, and there was all the puppies were running around playing, and then a new one came in whose behavior was clearly dysfunctional. You could see how aggression and fear go together. He would always run into a corner, and then if any dog came up to him, he would suddenly become aggressive and try to bite. And you can see, fear and anger, they go together, even in an animal. An animal is not really anger, but something almost like anger. So in everyone there is residual fear, no matter what your thoughts are, or even if you're free of thought, it can still be there, and that is part of the stored up old emotion of fear. Then there is the fear that is created by certain types of thinking, any type of future thinking, my life situation or my problematic situation, even one thought coming into your head about your problematic future. And if anybody's future is not problematic, I'd like to get to know that person. And very uncertain. Anything could happen to me. So, of course, when you project yourself into future, you immediately meet the uncertainty, the complete uncertainty. You could lose something very important to you, including your body. So, new fear is created through not being present, because in the present moment, there's usually nothing to fear. You can usually check that for yourself. Most fear is created through leaving the present moment mentally, projecting yourself into a possible future, which doesn't look good. Hope is the opposite of that. You project a future where things are going to get better. And then a hope thought can quickly shift into maybe it's not going to work out. And so you can experience almost the same thought that gives you hope for a moment while you lie in bed at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then, yeah, that'll get better, that'll happen. And then it shifts, it flips. Oh, maybe it won't happen. I won't get that. And fear immediately comes. The gap between, I believe it was Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, who said, anxiety is in the gap between now and then. Because that is the... So we have that's a mind-created gap. And the mind, which is compulsion to move into the future, creates a continuous undercurrent of fear. It tries to control the future. It can't. And so it's fearful. It tries to cope with the future. An imagined situation, you can't. You don't have the resource to cope with the future. Nobody does, because it doesn't even exist. So life does not give you the resource to cope with the future. The strengths, or whatever knowledge you need, the insight, the realization, the strength, the energy, future doesn't exist, so you can't cope with it. And people have piled up in their mind a sequence of things that are problematic. Could go wrong, might not happen, should happen, but might add. And then, of course, you can't cope with the future, it doesn't exist. You can always cope with this moment. This moment is always simple. If it's an emergency, it's very likely you don't even have time for fear. If it's an emergency, you will be forced into presence. And you will do something without needing to think. Something else takes over. Some people have experienced that when accidents were about to happen, and suddenly an inner shift occurred. All fear was there initially, and then suddenly, just as it was about to happen, all fear left them. There were many reports, and there was a sense of peace and intense aliveness. And out of that, if action was possible, action came. So, are you adding to the residual fear that is still in you? That's question 1. Am I adding to the fear by identifying with some kind of thought about the future? Or it could be a thought about somebody else that I feel close to and whose actions and whose life I cannot control, who may be getting into all kinds of impossible situations. It could be a child, and grown-up child, or teenage child. It could be anybody else close to you you don't know where they are and what they're doing. You know they're engaged in dangerous activities. And so many parents have the need to control the lives of their children. They want to protect them from possible harm. And even after they're grown up, they get extremely worried about what they're into. And yet, what they want to spare them suffering. And now, if you could truly do that, if you were omnipotent, and you could spare your child or the grown-up child suffering, there would be no development in the child whatsoever. Up to a point, the deepening in a human being happens through suffering. The arising of consciousness happens through suffering, through making mistakes. The most unprofitable life would be a life in which no mistakes were made. It's impossible, but only theoretically possible. So suffering is the spiritual teacher until you reach the point where you are now, where you suddenly realize, I don't need suffering anymore, because you choose presence. Up to that point, you have to be pushed into presence by life, which is consciousness, through suffering. Most of it is self-created. That's how it works. You can help, of course, as much as you can, you help. A very young child, you have to prevent from getting too close to the window or whatever it is, all those things, practical things. But beyond the practical, you have to allow other humans to make mistakes, to do what they feel is right to do, even if you know very well this is wrong and will lead to suffering, instead of lying awake all night worrying about what they are doing. There's nothing you can do. So, the fear can arise because you have thoughts about somebody close to you or yourself. So that is the fear that is created now through future projection. And when there's enough presence in you, can recognize that as I'm creating fear. My mind is creating fearful thoughts. And you believe in every fearful thought. And then the corresponding emotion comes. Many people shake with fear in their warm bed in the middle of the night. To bring you back to reality, the reality test is a useful question that I may have mentioned before. You could put it on your bedside table. What is the problem now? What is there to fear at this moment? Because if it's not now, where is it? And then you open your eyes, you look around the room or switch on the light. Where's the monster? Where is the dreadful event? In my head. And then there's the residual fear that you still carry. Even if your mind is not creating it, it may suddenly come up as an emotion. It could be the pain body. It could be an isolated emotion, perhaps drifting up from the pain body. And you are not even thinking about future, and it can come in meditation. It often does, because meditation is going deeper into yourself. And what the ego fears most is its own end. It fears your presence. So when there's a letting go into the present moment, a relaxing, the tightness, the contraction with which the fear was being held down opens, and often what comes up is fear. It's the fear of the end of the egoic entity. The fear of the end of my problems, the fear of the end of me as a mind-made entity. So when it happens in meditation, fear rises, and now you need to observe whether it's created by a thought about future or whether it just seems to come by itself. If it's created by a thought, you can see the fallacy of the thought. It's not, it's about future. Then you don't believe in the thought anymore, and you bring attention back into the body or to your breath, and then the fear also goes. But if it's not associated with the thought and suddenly comes up, what do? It is what is at this moment. So you feel it fully, instead of thinking about it. Instead of thinking, how can I get rid of this? Or what can I do about it? Or I don't want to feel this. Are you arguing with the present moment? what is at this moment inside you. And if there's a quiver of fear, that's what is. And you bring attention to it. Say, that is the fear. And then you don't say anything anymore. You simply allow it to be there. It doesn't feel pleasant, but it won't kill you. It has killed some people, but not people who were aware of it and allowed it to be, but people who were totally identified with it, completely identified with that emotion. Then it could kill you. But if you are aware of it and allow it to be as it is, and notice it's not going to kill me, it may not feel pleasant, it's like feeling almost a physical feeling of unwellness. There it is, and you feel it. And you may sometimes feel that it wants to become thoughts. The emotion wants to become thoughts, or the mind is attempting to explain the fear that you feel by creating some image that works the other way around. Sometimes the mind creates fear, but it's also the residual fear that is in you. Sometimes is the mind doesn't know what to do with it. Why do I feel fear? And then it creates some explanation or some image why you feel fear that works the other way around. So fear can be created by a fearful thought, but a fearful thought can also be created by the residual fear in you that's already there, that has been there for a long time. And that is often the case in dreams, where nightmares, when you feel intense fear in a dream. And you may believe that the image that you are dreaming is creating the fear. The monster that you're trying to get away from in the dream is creating the fear. The fear is the residual fear that lives in you, probably associated with the pain body, the bundle of emotions that have come together to form the pain body. So what you're experiencing is the residual fear, and the mind needs to somehow make sense of this, so it attempts to find an image to explain it. And in the dream it becomes a nightmare. In a very unconscious person, or in somebody in whom the fear is very intense, the fear in daily life can turn into so-called paranoia, which is a complete misperception of reality in which you see other people or groups of people as your enemies who want to do you harm. This is only a more pronounced form of the normal egoic state. The normal egoic state is very suspicious of other people. It wants to use them, it also fears them. It misinterprets very often their behavior. So there is element of paranoia in every ego. The fear of others, even the need to have enemies, to make them into enemies. And it's more pronounced than it's recognized as a form of insanity. But what is it? It is the mind's attempt to explain the intense fear that I feel. And therefore it cannot explain it, but the mind wants some explanation. So it creates a reality that seems to explain the continuous fear that I feel. A fearful reality. It doesn't know that the fear that you feel comes from the past. It's part of the pain body. There is no explanation here at the present moment for it. So it's an attempt of the mind to explain, and it becomes unreality. So the quickest way beyond fear, yes, detect if it's created by a thought. You can see the thought, and then you can drop the thought or your belief in the thought and come back to the present moment. Or the residual fear that is in you that wants to become thought too. And if possible, watch the fear as an energy that lives in you so that it doesn't turn into thinking. So you watch it directly. It doesn't feel good, but it's like it's bad weather inside, no more. So bad weather outside is not that bad, it's actually quite nice when you accept it. When the mind says this is dreadful weather, it's dreadful. But when you allow it to be, even so-called bad weather is quite beautiful. So you allow the fear to be as it is. You give it space to be, because that's the form that this moment takes. You give it space to be, and then you may notice the space around the fear, so to speak. It's almost a metaphorical way of putting it. The space around the fear gets bigger. And then you notice there's actually a vast space. The more you allow it, the more you become aware of space around it, inner space around the fear. The more there is a distance between you and the fear. And there's the fear, what before was overpowering, you didn't even want to look at it or feel it, suddenly is realized as a tiny energy movement compared to the vastness of space around it. And that happens when you allow it to be and watch it. It becomes transmuted. Even the residual fear from the past becomes transmuted. Be very much aware of the danger of the fear, the residual fear, influencing your thinking, controlling your thinking. You remember the two movements. When you are not very present, fear creates certain thoughts, fear thoughts. Or the other way, fear thoughts create fear. The residual fear creates also more thoughts when you're not very present. People talk about trusting in life. They say,